Faith Forward Media, this is Healthcare Musings. I'm Dr. Hashem Hasabala. Welcome to Healthcare Musings, everybody. Happy to have you with me. Okay, so it is, I think, a universal experience of intensivists, whether they are tele-intensivists or on-site intensivists, that once or twice or 10 times in a day, you will be notified by the ICU nursing staff of a abnormal serum potassium. And abnormal serum potassium, is not, low serum potassium. It's below 4, right? Even though the lab has a normal range, typically between 3.5 and 5.1, right? That's the normal serum potassium range. But for some reason, everywhere I've practiced across the country, East Coast, Midwest, and West Coast, there is it's universal. Once the serum potassium drops below 4, I am asked to replace it, right? And I've always wondered, like, where does this come from? Like, where is there any evidence behind it? Of course, a low serum potassium does potentially prolong the QT interval, which does potentially cause or put you at risk for arrhythmias such as torsade de pointe, right? But even if they have a couple of premature ventricular complexes or a couple of premature atrial complexes, they'll check electrolytes because it must be the serum potassium. I'm not even talking about magnesium here; it's serum potassium. And so I was like always wondering, like, what is it about serum potassium? Is there evidence? And so I entered into this great resource called Open Evidence. Every physician with a NPI in the United States can get a free account. It's like an AI powered resource based on PubMed, based on the published literature. And so I asked, and before I continue, I thought there's going to be no evidence for keeping the serum potassium above 4. And I was wrong. So when I looked up the evidence, there is strong evidence supporting keeping the potassium more than 4 in those people with cardiovascular disease, particularly those at risk for ventricular arrhythmias, heart failure, or acute myocardial infarction. The American College of Cardiology, the American Heart Association, and the Heart Rhythm Society recommend targeting potassium levels between 4 and 5 in patients at risk for ventricular arrhythmias and sudden cardiac death, as hypokalemia increases the risk of arrhythmias, including torsade de pointe and ventricular fibrillation. And apparently there's a National Council on Potassium in Clinical Practice, and it also, I didn't know that, and it also advises maintaining potassium at least 4 in patients with heart disease to reduce the risk of life-threatening arrhythmias. And this is based on observational data and meta-analyses that demonstrate a U-shaped relationship between serum potassium and mortality, with the lowest risk observed at the bottom of the U, observed at potassiums between 4 and 4.5 in general and cardiovascular populations. In patients with heart failure, potassium levels below 4 are associated with increased long-term mortality, while levels above 5 confer short-term risk. I mean, in my mind, a high potassium is way worse than a low potassium. But apparently in patients with heart disease, there's pretty good evidence that you really need to keep them above 4. Okay, fine. But here's the problem, okay? It's been extrapolated to everybody. So everybody that comes into the ICU needs a potassium above 4. Everybody that comes to the hospital needs a potassium above 4. And that causes huge amounts of cost to the patient, right? It's costly. All that potassium costs money. It's painful when you give IV potassium in the IV. The oral potassium pills are huge, and patients don't like them. And so, why is it being extrapolated to the general population? That's always been my question. So then I asked Is there any evidence that potassiums between 3.4 and 3.5 and 4, right, just within the normal range but below 4, does that increase mortality? And it said that there is strong evidence that maintaining potassium between 3.5 and 4 is associated with increased mortality compared to higher normal levels, again, in patients with cardiovascular and renal disease. So, again, they found the lowest mortality risk is generally found at potassium between 4 and 4.5, and patients with potassiums between 3.5 and 4 have significantly higher short-term and longer-term mortality compared to those with the high normal range. And there was recent randomized and observational data, including a 2025 New England Journal study that supports targeting potassium in the high normal range, 4.5 to 5, for patients at high risk for ventricular arrhythmias. Okay, so again, those at high risk for arrhythmias. It doesn't say everybody, right? And so it asked me, then it said, do you want me to summarize the specific patient populations? And so I said, yes. So here is what again, based on PubMed, this is according to Open Evidence, which is a great resource. So here's what it said. Patients with cardiovascular disease at high risk for ventricular arrhythmias, particularly those with ICDs, implantable cardioverter defibrillators, benefit from targeting potassium in the high normal range, 4 to 4.5, specifically 4.5 to 5. So, and then they give the evidence. Patients with heart failure, including those with reduced ejection fraction, also show benefit, right? Patients with chronic kidney disease also experience the lowest risk of all-cause and cardiovascular mortality when potassium is maintained in the 4 to 4.5 range. Okay, so now here's my point. And I'm kind of right. Here's what it says. Limitations and gaps remain for other populations, such as those without cardiovascular or renal disease, where evidence is lacking and further research is needed to define optimal potassium targets. That's my point. So patients with renal disease, again, benefit from, maybe a potassium above 4. Patients with heart disease, cardiovascular disease, heart failure, those at increased risk for ventricular arrhythmias, okay, I get it. Those people require potassiums above 4. And you know what? To be honest, many of our patients that are who are admitted to the ICU have underlying renal disease, have underlying cardiac disease, have underlying heart failure. And so, yeah, maybe in the ICU. And again, there's very little evidence that everybody in the hospital, no matter if somebody who's totally healthy and comes in for a leg cellulitis without any other disease, comorbid condition, there's very little evidence that it says that you have to target their potassium and keep it above 4, right? And I think maybe we should not put people on electrolyte protocols who have no underlying heart or kidney disease, right? In the hyperkalemia is just as dangerous, right? So I think we have to be very, very careful. And then in addition, there was a study called the TITE-K trial that they found that when you supplement, but this is in patients after cardiac surgery, okay? After cardiac surgery, if you only replace the potassium when it falls below 3.6, it was non-inferior to maintaining levels above 4.5 for prevention of atrial fibrillation, which is one type of atrial arrhythmia. Right? There was no advantage in keeping it high normal. That's after cardiac surgery, right? And so it's not like it's no big deal. They just make sure everybody's potassium is above 4. Not necessarily. And after all that, I must admit that there is pretty strong evidence that keeping your potassium above 4 in patients with heart disease and renal disease, especially those at high risk for arrhythmias, is beneficial, and there's very strong evidence behind it. So, I guess I'm just going to have to remember that and place people on the electrolyte replacement protocol who are appropriate. And, our nursing colleagues are right. For many patients, I do have to do something when the potassium goes below 4. Thanks, everybody, for your time and attention, and we'll see you next time on Healthcare Musings. Thank you for listening. Sign up at healthcaremusings.com to get every episode delivered directly to your email. And please don't forget to leave a 5-star review. Thank you so much.